Good morning and a warm welcome to you all. We are happy to be here again presenting the results of the Gender Equality Index. In 2020, our life changed dramatically. All of a sudden, our homes became a one-stop shop to eat, sleep, work, and socialize. And for many, even homes became improvised schools and daycare centers. Since then, this reality has been changing, and the world has been facing new turbulences and new crises, as the war in Ukraine, the rising energy prices, and then, of course, the rising cost of living as a consequence. What comes next is unknown, but what we do know for sure is that March 2020 forever changed our life. This reality is for the first time covered in the Gender Equality Index, because this new edition is mainly using 2020 data. As in previous editions of the index, we have faced problems related to data availability. And this is the case, for instance, of the domain of time. The domain of time was not updated in this edition because of the lack of new data. But what we have done instead is to use an AGES survey focused on time spent on unpaid care, and this covers childcare, long-term care, and housework. So today, we are going to present the findings of the index together with some findings of this AGES survey. For starters, the index has shown a very slow improvement in the last decade. Back in 2020, we emphasized that it could take around 60 years to reach gender equality if we continue moving at this snail's pace. And the index this year is only confirming that a slow progress. Looking at the overall picture, the 2022 index for the EU is 68.6 out of 100 points. This is a tiny improvement of 0.6 points from the past year, and an improvement of only 5.5 points from 2010. But as you can imagine, the picture is more nuanced than that. So we need to go deeper into individual countries and individual domains in order to know what is happening on the ground. So what can we say about the situation in the EU countries?
Yes, it is important to note that there are still big variations between countries, because not all countries are moving in the same directions and at the same pace. Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands are still the best performer in the EU also this year. However, for the first time, also Sweden and Denmark did not improve. They have stalled over the pandemic. And despite being the best performer, they are still far from reaching gender equality. And farther down the line, we have 7 member states whose score is 60 points, below 60 points. All these countries have many room for improvement and need to faster the progress. Since the last edition, the greatest increases were found in Lithuania, Belgium, Croatia, and the Netherlands. On the other hand, score of 4 countries decreased over the pandemic. Romania has decreased the most, followed by Latvia, Estonia, and France. If you would like to have more information on every single country on the way to gender equality, you will find more data, analysis, and information on our website.
Now we move to the domains and subdomains. They look at different areas of life, and they show a huge difference in the results. In the domain of time, we will see that for the first time, the scores of participation in the labor market decrease. And this is mainly due to a decrease in two key areas: employment, but also in the number of years that we expect to be in the labor force throughout the life course. This is happening in a highly gender-segregated labor market, where more women than men are working in sectors characterized by a low pay, a low status, and then this gives the women less possibilities for career growth. Such inequalities have particularly hard consequences on different groups of women. And this includes younger and older women, mothers, single mothers with dependent children, and also women from migrant communities. Young women between 15 and 24 years old were particularly impacted in sectors most affected by the pandemic, and this includes sectors with a highly share of temporary workers and with low social security rights. This left many young people vulnerable to an instant loss of income and to poor career and economic prospects. When it comes to pay, we see that the largest differences in earnings are between women and men aged 65 plus years old. This is only reflecting the impact that the lifelong gender segregation in the labor market has. And this is caused mainly because breaks in the career or part-time work or the persistent gender segregation. So we are going to see how in other areas there is a mixed picture. So there are areas where we see a progress and also areas where we see steps back.
Yeah. Within our survey, we had also a closer look how the pandemic impacted on the working arrangement and work-life balance. Over the pandemic, the share of workers adopting home-based teleworking daily or several times a week increased from 31% to 49%. However, we all know that although home-based teleworking is increased the flexibility in time and location, it came also with risks. For instance, 20% of women and 50% of men had no time to be interrupted in their daily activity, work activity, less than 1 hour by their children. In terms of work-life balance, we also discovered that men had much more opportunity to use flexi time to cope with care duties and paid work. We also saw that over the pandemic, a huge amount of women were pushed out from the labor market. And for 1 in 3, the main reason was caring. We also note that over the pandemic, there's been a huge increase on childcare between women and men, around 1/5 for each, women and men. However, while housework is becoming more shared between women and men, childcare is still an activity uneven distributed between women and men. Specifically, when we are looking at the high-intensity childcare, as many as twice women as men spend more than 4 hours per day in caring activities. Now, let's move onto the domain of knowledge. Here again, we have found for the first time since 2010 a decrease in the scores, specifically in participation in education. This is mostly due to 2 different trends. One is referred to participation in formal and informal education. There's been a really huge and dramatic drop for both women and men over the pandemic, but still women are lagging behind. On the other side, the women with tertiary education increased over the pandemic more than what it did for men. And in this case, the gap is to the detriment of men. COVID pandemic has also had a huge impact on education, field of education, through school closure and switching to online teaching. We saw that this has an effect on boys and girls, mainly on boys in this case. Boys have been much more at risk of early school leaving, and at the same time, the number of boys, neither in education nor in employment, increased more than what it did for girls.
Now, looking at the domain of health, we see that for the first time since 2010, shows decreases in some components, namely health status and access to healthcare services. As we all know, COVID created an unprecedented pressure on the health sector and exposed its fragility. So it's extremely important to study and to highlight how the pandemic had different impacts in different populations groups. For instance, women and men with disabilities, or women and men, older women and men, have reported higher unmet needs for medical checks over the pandemic. Or another fact, women are overrepresented in frontline sectors. And we know that these workers faced extreme risk and pressure during the pandemic. So women are more likely to suffer the after effects of these infections and also the post-traumatic stress, depression, and burnout. Also, young people were severely affected by the pandemic, not only in terms of work and education, as we mentioned before, but also in relation to mental health. Evidences from different EU member states show that there has been an increase in the suicide rates among young people, especially boys, during the pandemic. But we mentioned just before that we see a mixed picture with progress and also with step backs. So, Davide, please tell us, where do we find these positive developments?
Yes, Irene, like every year we found in the domain of power. Also this year, the domain of power is progressing faster compared to other domains, but it's still the domain with the lowest score. Much of this progress is due to the increased participation of women in economic and political decision-making. As regards economic decision-making, the proportion of women board members of the largest quoted company has reached in 2022 the all-time high of 32%. But still, 7 in 10 of these members are men. These results are clearly linked to the introduction of binding measures in a small number of countries in the EU, while other countries that did not introduce any measures, they are still stalling. This clearly underlines the importance of the agreement reached by the European Parliament and the European Council last June on the directive of the increased gender balance in corporate boards. This is a win, of course. We can celebrate, but this is not enough. We still know that women are underrepresented in all areas of decision-making. And this had also an impact over the pandemic. Just an example, over the pandemic until March 2022, only 1 in 4 ministers of health in the EU were women.
Before we conclude, let's look beyond the core domains of the index and talk about the domain of violence. Due to the lack of EU-wide data, the domain of violence is not updated in this edition of the index. But we know from recent AGES research that the prevalence and severity of violence against women and girls have increased during the pandemic. The lockdowns in all the EU countries meant that women and girls were trapped at home with their abusers. Also, the economic fallout of the pandemic on women led to financial insecurity, and this reduced as well the possibilities for women to leave their abusive relations. On top of that, we also know that young women are more likely to suffer digital forms of violence, like cyberbullying or online harassment, that have increased also significantly during the course of the pandemic. So, well, with all of that in mind, what are the key things we want you to take away from this year index?
Yes, for the first time since its inception, the Gender Equality Index has seen decreased in some important areas of the domain of work, knowledge, and health, and no improvement at all in other areas, right, like segregation in education and work, and economic situation of women and men. Progress of the Gender Equality Index and gender equality in the EU is still mainly driven by the domain of power. Without the domain of power, this year the Gender Equality Index has probably fallen. So we cannot hinder that there are many inequalities still persisting. These results indicate an uneven distribution and the impact of pandemic on socioeconomic situation of women and men, aggravating existing inequalities and putting disadvantaged groups at risk. Considering that, as Irene said, this index 2022 is based on 2020 data, next year with 2021 data, we are expecting probably more and significant decreases. We are facing in this period uncertainty and crisis, and we will probably facing two in the future. So we need to understand that we are at a crossroad, and we need to do something. We have a choice, two choices. We can go on losing focus and risk further risks and step backs. In this case, we will probably take much more than 60 years to reach gender equality. Or we can faster the pace. We can do progress and increase our efforts. It's really in our hands. Thank you so much.